So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War, and to something of a rarity really from Silmarillion at the very least, because this is a sort of larger siege battle, a more open siege battle for sure, where most of the defensive points are from natural terrain features rather than any sort of built fortifications, but still, it's going to be a siege battle nonetheless on a larger map. It also has a unified theme where all of the defenders, I believe, are forces of good, and all of the attackers over there are forces of evil, so this is pretty good to see. I'm yet to decide whether this is a midweek or weekend slot, but based on when you're watching it, you will easily be able to determine that, of course. But yeah, as far as the map itself goes, I mean, here we have a rather wintry theme, which is still very appropriate for the time of year this will release in. We've got these ruins dotted throughout as well, offering a little bit of cover to the defenders, as well as all of the terrain they can use to funnel the attackers as they wish to. We've got some ghostly fire over here as well, which is pretty intimidating. Some of these buildings on the coast seem sort of newer made, so some people are coming in to scope these ruins out for sure. Interesting as well. Got these sort of towers as well, so a lot of these assets have been added in more recently to Silmarillion, I believe, which is good to see. Always good to see new stuff. But yeah, we'll get right on with going through the attacking armies first and foremost, I believe, and I think it is all three of the orc-focused factions that are going to be on the attack today. Starting off with the horrors of Dungortheb, played by Boris, the Soviet Lovehammer. Karangwi Goreswarm here at the front. I mean, Dungortheb in general are probably the least durable in terms of the individual units that they have, in terms of the bulk of their army. Their monstrous units are a little bit different, of course, but they are a little bit of an awkward faction to play. I mean, in a siege battle like this especially, you need to use them at the right time, because if you commit their monsters too early, then they're going to not have the impact you want, and then the rest of your army isn't going to have the muscle to really gain you any sort of ground, especially when you're being funneled into disadvantageous positions. I mean, the Karangwi Goreswarm here are going to be here for their numbers primarily. I mean, if you slam them into a well-prepared and pretty elite front line from some of the Elven factions, they're not going to do much on their own, but they can at least swarm over the enemy. The Duso Manuthan over here, we've got Duso Manuthan Beast Hunters, which are the archer variant of the Duso Manuthan foot soldiers that Dungortheb have at the centre of their army. Of course, again, in terms of archery, they very rarely are going to win you any sort of fight, but they will engage with the enemy, and they will allow the rest of your units to potentially not have arrows coming their way. I mean, it's one of those catch-22s for a force that's trying to deal with lower tier archers such as this, or at least easier to deal with archers such as this, is if you leave them to their own devices, they will rack up a kill count, which you can't really afford to let cheaper units like this do. But if you do go after them, of course, it means that you're not going after the infantry force, which is probably what Dungortheb would prefer in this situation, if they can get close enough, of course, to counteract that terrain advantage that the defenders over there do have. Duso Manuthan Skull Splitters over here with their throwing axes. I believe this is a throwing axe unit based on their stance, but yeah, Skull Splitters. Again, Duso Manuthan units across the board are not going to have the best in terms of armour, but they are going to be numerous units, and they are going to be surprisingly savage in melee as well, especially against more lightly armoured forces on the defence. The Duso Manuthan can actually do a decent amount of damage, but of course the real core of the Dungortheb army does lie elsewhere. Over here we've got the Duso Manuthan Flesh Feasters, which is the best of the standard infantry that Dungortheb can field. Dual wield axe units, so again they're going to be pretty damn good against more lightly armoured forces, and they do have a bit more armour to back them up as well. They are in general more of a genuine threat as far as an infantry unit goes, so especially if you're a more lightly armoured Elven faction, for example, the Flesh Feasters will be something that you don't want to engage too lightly. You're going to have to try and go about your business in a different way. They don't have shields, so even the armour isn't going to save them from concentrated higher tier arrow fire, for example. Just over here we've got some Karangwi Banelings. I think they're a new unit, so we'll get to see them in action. Of course, another unit of spiders. Again, the arachnophobes among you are not going to enjoy Dungortheb in action. We've got the Karangwi Broodmothers as well, which for all intents and purposes are pretty similar. Anyone who's been involved in Third Age content for any length of time will be aware of these more monstrous units with infantry on their back, Mumakil being the best example of them. The Karangwi Broodmothers, so you've got the Javelin Men on the back, and then you've got the giant spiders who will be able to crash through lines and do area of effect damage in melee pretty effectively as well. The Urish Abomination, which is one of, I think, 2, possibly 3 examples now of single living artillery pieces, essentially, but he flings giant fiery projectiles across the map. It's not quite as devastating as Catapult, but you will be able to do it for an extended length of time, and of course, you know, a catapult crew has a tendency to be a little bit more vulnerable than a giant monster wielding a big axe, so a bit more multifaceted perhaps. We'll see if the Abomination is able to do the business against those fortified positions. And at the back, Dusommanuthan Predators, which are going to be a Javelin unit, again similar to the other basic Dusommanuthan units anyway that we've already seen. They are going to be, their effectiveness is really going to be determined by how much attention they receive from defending projectiles and what positions they can get in before they have to get into melee. Of course, you want to be using those javelins first and foremost. Now, at the centre of this attack, we have Panthan of Barsoom playing as Angband. Angband, probably the most, on average, the most effective faction in Silmarillion that we've seen across the entirety of its development. I think that's because what they're strong at, Medieval 2 has a tendency to reward more often than not. Really solid, survivable, heavy infantry that are capable of taking a real beating, and then they've got some damage bonuses as well, where the base mechanics of Medieval 2 have a tendency to reward that as well. Silmarillion does do a pretty good job of making many different play styles viable, but Medieval 2 at its base will still reward this kind of force, I think. Especially when you're on the attack, Angband are going to be pretty reliable, you would say, with their survivability and with their numbers. Detachments of Ironshod Arbalists, I mean, maybe a little bit light on numbers. They will be one of the first ports of call for any defending archers to try and mow down, but we all know how effective crossbows can be if you give them the time of day. Thralls of Angband are going to be somewhat similar to the Dusommanuthan archers that we saw from Dungortheb, in the sense that they're not going to be winning many skirmish fights, but they will at least allow you to engage at long range with the enemy and not allow the defenders to have free reign at long range with their own archers. Of course, Angband is one of the factions in the game that does have access to a phalanx unit. It's not given that you'll have one, and even if you do, of course, you know, pikes are even rarer than these halberdiers, but halberds are still going to be very, very useful if you can anchor your line in place. The armor-piercing damage, the phalanx, everyone knows how effective they can be based on Medieval 2 mechanics, another way in which Angband are fairly comfortable in terms of how the game shakes up. Tormentors of the Iron Crown are another very useful unit, especially in this kind of situation with their heavy armour, their big shields, and depending upon who they're facing as well, the maces that they have with the armour-piercing damage that they bring to the table is also very handy, although that does have a tendency to be a little bit more variable in Silmarillion. There are less armour-focused factions, but still, if there are some on the defence, they will find themselves on the receiving end of that armour-piercing damage as well. Fairly expensive for an Orcish unit, but pretty much worth it, 9 times out of 10 you would say in this situation. Ironshod Legionaries are of course the lower end unit. They do have the armour upgrade, as you can see here. They're also very numerous as well. They don't have the armour piercing damage nor the overall defensive stats of the Tormentors in front of them, but being cheaper and being more numerous is obviously a boon in and of itself in this kind of battle. Moving across, we have the upgraded or the unupgraded, I should say, Ironshod Legionaries as well. We have another unit of them. Spearguard of the Iron Crown, so the spear variant, of course, a little bit more defensively savvy perhaps, and obviously with an anti-cavalry bonus as well. But they do lack the infantry killing power of the Tormentors, but other than that, very similar units with their armour and their shield values being similar to one another. Scourges of Gothmog, they're a relatively, low numbers unit actually, but in terms of their abilities in melee, especially against more lightly armoured units, as a counterpoint to the Tormentors, they're going to be very effective. So again, it rather depends upon who they end up facing as to how efficient they're going to be. Reavers of Anfalgleaf, they've changed a little bit since the last time we saw them. It used to be they were an axe and shield unit, but to differentiate them a little bit more from the Ironshod Legionaries than they already were, they've now been given a javelin as a sort of auxiliary damage unit, so that's something else that Angband have as a feather in their cap now. And at the back, some Spearguard of the Iron Crown and the Mangonel manned by a unit of Ironshod Legionaries as well. Not seeing any bodyguard tier units. It's possible that I've simply missed the Bulldogs. Actually, I don't think so. Oh no, yeah, the Bulldogs are over here. So again, one of the scarier sword and board units that the game has to offer this. Very, very powerful, of course, and it's not too surprising to see them, which is why I took a second look. But yeah, Angband front and centre, and now we will be moving on to the third and final attacking force, the Dominion of Gaurhoth, played by Windy Pops. Good to see him. Gaurhoth, a more warg-focused faction. They do have more heavy infantry options than Dungortheb, less monster options, though. Kind of a happy middle ground, I guess, between the two orcish factions as it happens, but they also have that warg focus, which gives them those fast movers. The Hishtwukras, Zagula here, Javelin Cavalry, which again is good. I don't think sallying out against these three orcish factions is necessarily the best idea for any defending forces that may be, simply because all three of them have got the ability to counteract sally outs with, not making it too difficult on themselves. Hishtwukras Hunters, of course, all of the orcish factions as a general rule have got these relatively basic, lighter but more numerous units of archers. The same thing applies to these hunters as applies to the Thralls of Angband and to the Duso-Manuthan archers as well. That's actually a defending force. We'll get more onto the House of Finarfin in just a moment. Interesting to see how far back the rest of the Gaurhoth army is. This little campsite that they seem to have set up for themselves. Scarahai Blood Drinkers are an armour-piercing unit of shock infantry with a pretty savage charge, actually, but of course all of the defensive shortcomings that you would expect from a unit such as this. Hishtwukras Howlers are a pretty decent unit to send into the front line, and they will simply fight until they're dead for the most part, and that can be a surprisingly effective thing, even though they have some defensive shortcomings in terms of their armour and the lack of a shield. More Hishtwukras there. We have the Laugskaras Zagula, which are a unit of lighter melee wargs, but very, very numerous. This is exactly the kind of unit which can make sallying out pretty difficult, because even though individually they're not the best, they can swarm over cavalry, and then as a general rule, Gaurhoth will have the ability to send support as well. Hishtwukras Warband, the basic unit of spears, as the Howlers are a basic unit of regular infantry. Trying to differentiate some of these units is a little bit hard, but you can see the rusted armour of the Gijak Skaras, which are the heavier units of Gaurhoth, the class of unit which Dungortheb really don't have, and the Wolfguard are in many ways a slightly lesser version of the Tormentors of the Iron Crown that we've already seen. They have the armor-piercing maces in the same way, and in the same way as well the Gijak Skaras Chosen fill that role that the Spearguard of the Iron Crown have as well. And yeah, it just gives that heavy infantry core to Gaurhoth, which allows them to be a little bit more effective in a situation like this, you would say. It gives them that solid centre, which is a little bit more useful than going full wargs as they perhaps would on the open field. More Howlers, plenty of the Hishtwukras, which means they're going to have numbers on their side as well. And I did just see as well, we have the Scarahai Pit Fighters, which are a somewhat scarier version of the Blood Drinkers that we've already seen. Again, big armour-piercing damage, not the most numerous unit in the world, and as we have seen before, they can be surprisingly fragile if isolated by arrow fire, but if they can get in and amongst the enemy, damage will be forthcoming. And the Hishtwukras Ash Priests, probably the single scariest unit on foot Gaurhoth can field. Very dangerous in melee, relentless, big armour-piercing damage, but also those fiery exploding projectiles are something else to bear in mind. Hopping over to the defenders then, and one force which has to march their way perhaps past the enemy, although I think they could actually go around and take the mountain path, so we'll see what happens with the House of Finarfin, played by Swampert over here. Sartor Finderato are a not very numerous unit at all, but certainly a very strong and defensive unit of spears. Very, very nice. A second unit of them as well, so going for two, one of which has the general in it, the other one can be used a little bit more freely perhaps. We have the Company of Prince Gwindor, which are a unit of standard line infantry. Their unique thing is more of a gimmick than anything else. It's a neat gimmick, but it's the fact that their charge range is a little bit longer, so it means that you can catch out enemy units a little bit more easily with them. It's not really going to be the most relevant thing when you're on a siege defence like this. It's the sort of thing which will come in more handy in sort of team pitch battles, I think, potentially, to try and catch the enemy out when they're manoeuvring. But here, they're going to be more useful for their defensive prowess. A very expensive looking army this, though, from the House of Finarfin, because in addition to the two units of elite spears, they've also gone for the Arqueni Mormagilwa, which are one of the strongest units of two-handed infantry that the game has to offer. Again, big damage. They're going to be very, very effective against some of the, especially the lighter units of orcs that are coming at them. We'll see how they do over the long haul in the battle. Marksman of Nargothrond, I think these are the split shot projectiles, if I'm not mistaken. I think between themselves and Doriath, they're standard archers. One of them is split shots, one of them is silver thorns. I think these are the split shots, which is the more useful of the two when you're defending a siege like this, I would say. just because you can spread the damage out a little bit more equally. Archers of Talathdin, regular archers of course, but as we mentioned previously, archers like this and using the terrain to your advantage and really hammering home that heavy elven arrow damage is going to be pretty key for the defenders here. A couple units of them, and then the Wardens of Nargothrond, which overall are one of the more well-rounded units of spears that the game has to offer, because they do have a little bit of armor piercing damage, I believe, still. But even then, they've still got fantastic defensive stats. It's an interesting army composition this though from Finarfin. I mean, going heavily in for those bodyguard units is an interesting choice. It's a small army, so we'll see. Interesting to see no bridge wards as well, one of the few units of pikes the game has to offer. The realm of DOL CUARTHOL is a faction that we haven't seen up until this point, so this is going to be all new. The guardsmen of the two captains, obviously we have a unit of basic spears here, or at least more basic spears. And just in behind them we have the Dread Helms. So I think based on this, based on the weaponry they have, it's a throwing projectile unit. So they're going to be in behind the spears. I guess considering this is a battle that is happening on the coast, the realm here is a pretty good choice because they are a coastal faction. Guardsmen of the two captains once again. Rangers of the two captains. So of course archers, even though it's not an elven faction expressly, archers are still going to be important for any defensive force in this kind of position, so the Rangers will see what they are capable of doing. I have a feeling that this is the kind of faction as well which is going to have access to a few units that can hide at the very least. Raiders of DOL CUARTHOL, basic unit of infantry this, but everyone's going to have to do their bit. I mean, I suppose they're a bit more of a numerous faction as well, just by the fact that they're not an elven faction, so that might make up a little bit more for the fact that Finarfin have gone very equality heavy, perhaps too much so. Huntsmen of the two captains, javelins, so that's another good bit of utility. Old Company of the House of Ransom, having a look at them, so we have again archers, axes in melee, a good well-rounded unit for this sort of situation as well. Axemen in melee are going to be really good against the lighter orcs, and of course those arrows as well, going to be very, very useful. More Rangers of the two captains, that's getting into the other elven factions on display. We've got the Brigands of DOL CUARTHOL, which, again, adding a bit of armor piercing damage in comparison to the Raiders, which have axes. These guys have got little morning stars, so again, that's a little bit more varied there. Huntsmen of the two captains, and as I said, we're probably going to see a couple more units make themselves known as the battle goes on, but for the time being, they are occupying the central defensive position. And finally we have the Elves of the Falas, another coastal faction in fact, so makes sense that they're here also. Marines of Brythombar, the Brythombar units being the lighter force, of course, more javelins for the defenders as well as the attackers come forward. I mean, javelins are a little bit more present in Silmarillion, you have to say, that pretty much every faction's got access to them, and they do represent a pretty important part of how the meta of the game works. Marksmen of Balar, heavy archers, this is going to be a very important defensive unit as well. Unlike the split shots of the Nargothrond archers, these guys are a little bit more of a straight arrow, so to speak. But that might make them a little bit more useful in terms of counteracting the enemy skirmishers anyway. Deploying their stakes, as we can see here. Forward position here, again, more stakes have been deployed, some Rangers of Brythombar, but these guys will undoubtedly be retreating back to the main line of their defences anyway, just deploying those stakes to make it a little bit more awkward for, well, the wargs from DOL and Gaurhoth, I guess, to have free reign across the battlefield. Seafarers, a unit of lighter macemen, once again, kind of similar to the force that we saw from the realm of DOL CUARTHOL as well, those brigands. They'll be most useful, of course, against Angband and the Gijak Scarras from DOL and Gaurhoth, provided they are supported. Again, lighter macemen like this have a tendency to fall apart if they're not supported properly. They need to be part of a combined arms front line, otherwise they don't really work. And that's true of a lot of the regular units of the Falathrim. They need to fold into one another to be truly effective. There are a few examples of units that can stand on their own. Marines of Brythombar, not one such unit. More seafarers. One example of that, though, is the high tier Aran Kia Lim, one of the better units of heavy infantry of this type that the game has to offer. They can, of course, stand on their own, but they are a little bit more susceptible to the armor piercing that Angband, and in particular DOL and Gaurhoth, have in high numbers. So again, it's going to be interesting. The Falathrim also on the lowest portion of the settlement here, so terrain going to be maybe a little bit less available to them. Nobles of Balar, the only phalanx unit that we've seen so far for the defenders, which is good to see. They're going to need this kind of unit, I would suggest. The Nobles of Balar are one of the best examples of this kind of unit the game has to offer as well, because as two-handed spears, their stats aren't quite so compromised in close melee. They may not have the range of a unit like the Bridge Wards, but still, good armour, good defensive stats all round, more Aran Kialim, more Seafarers, so investing quite heavily in these light macemen here as Captain Gervais. The Orion Ephedune are another unit of very high tier spears, more of a shield value than the Sartor Finderato, although I think in terms of individual quality I think the Sartor do have the edge, but the Orion Ephedune will offer more or less the same sort of thing. And I think that's it. Again, the Falathrim are the kind of force that do have a few units that can hide, and as we are viewing this battle from the perspective of the attackers, we won't be able to see those just yet. But I think I will make a cut. I don't know how quickly this battle is going to get underway. I think they will allow Finarfin to get back into position. I mean, you could argue the fact that Finarfin should be made to take the long way round, considering where they've decided to deploy themselves, but we'll see how forgiving the attackers are willing to be. But I'll rejoin when the first blows are being struck, I think. So I think we will actually rejoin here, because the way that this is stacking up is looking to be a little bit interesting. You can see that the Urush Abomination is up here on a bit of high ground, and this of course means that the artillery projectiles will be able to find their way into the lower section of this defensive position that the defenders have taken up. And also something that I didn't really consider in the opening deployment phase of this battle is the fact that you can see there's a defensive position over there, but also the attackers could take this route around, and that is what's going to be happening with at least a detachment of, I think, all three attacking armies actually. I think Dungortheb, Tolin Gaurhoth and Angband are all going to send a little force over here to, again, try and work in all of their strengths. I think there are a few Finarfin units lurking in the trees over here, unless they have rapidly retreated along the coast over here, but the same problems will still arise for the attackers going this way, because they will either have to go via this very narrow section over here, or again put themselves at a fairly significant terrain disadvantage. But this here is going to be the centre point of the defence, you would suggest, this area of ruins up on this bit of raised terrain. It's not going to be quite so easy, regardless of how the attackers decide to try and approach it, to force the defenders off of this position. Though trying to pick away at all the defensive points around that may still yield some good results. We've got some units positioning themselves accordingly over here. 2 units of the Sartor Finderato, not entirely sure where they were going. I mean, to be fair, that lighthouse structure over on that island is reachable. You can always tell when water is traversable because it's got those little boulders poking up out of it, so the defenders could go over there if they so chose, but retreating from their first choice of defensive position up here on the hill over to there is unlikely to be an option. And now the artillery begins, as well as the first instances of ranges of the 2 captains taking some hits there. First instances of the Ishbuk Krauss Hunters doing their thing as well. The Farathir Beleg, one of the units from DOL CUARTHOL, that have revealed themselves from hiding. You can see poison projectiles, the telltale black trails from them, and a good amount of damage as well. Of course, they're going to have to get a little bit closer if they want to return fire here, but yeah, the combination of all of the defending archers here should be more than enough to deal with the archers, if nothing else. But there you can see the attacking siege engines already proving themselves to be a bit of a menace. Rangers Brithon Bar, that was a huge amount of the DOL CUARTHOL Rangers, however, which also fell away. Thralls of Angband going to potentially try and shoot point blank into the marksman of Balar here. I mean, in terms of a one-to-one engagement, that's a relatively easy one. Meanwhile, Tormentors of the Iron Crown getting ambushed here by the Drogath Rui, spear being the primary weapon. I mean, DOL CUARTHOL in general aren't going to see the most use of Angband's armour piercing. Scouts of the 2 captains charging in here as well, so reasonably well orchestrated ambush this from DOL CUARTHOL, and considering the lighter nature of the faction overall, you would suggest that was intentional. Meanwhile, these smoke bombs are really something, aren't they? Lancers of the 2 captains. I mean, in terms of seeing what you're doing, I mean, it's difficult enough for need to do such now. Scouts of the two captains could return fire into the Broodmother. I think the issue here is that while the initial ambush has gone pretty well and they've done some good damage to the Tormentors, the Gore Swarm on the way forward as well, the main problem they're going to run into here is the fact that, you know, sheer weight of numbers of the attackers over here going to be the main problem. Still, this, again, specialty unit of DOL CUARTHOL has done pretty well for itself. But, yeah, they're wavering and ultimately break in the face of insurmountable odds. The cavalry support not enough. Lancers of the two captains getting caught up on the Gore Swarm as well. So, ultimately, I think the attackers will still be pretty pleased with how that has transpired. Marksman of Balar pulling back, still fiery projectiles being used. I mean, I am quite surprised at how little initial resistance has been put up here. I mean, the terrain advantage has pretty much dried up now because the attackers have established a foothold, but that was because no real resistance was being put up anyway. Marksman of Nargothrond are here, Huntsman of the two captains in close proximity. This column marching into the front line, combination of the guardsmen and the Wardens of Nargothrond, again all spear units, so defensively pretty adept, but it is the elven ones who will be more effective, but they're not quite actually in combat just yet. Ironshard Legionaries meanwhile, morale could be a potential issue here for forces like Angband. They've got a lot of angles to cover now though. Again, Nafatoon-esque projectiles being used by the Dreadhelms. We already saw them in the deployment phase. Good amounts of consistent damage being done, but it does look as though they need a relatively linear line of sight to the enemies that they are targeting. Again, combination of the Guardsmen and Wardens of Nargothrond forming up the main front line here. Victory seems certain for the time being. Ironshard Halberdiers, when they get situated, however, could change that around. Urush Abomination yet to truly open up. Combination of archers up here on the high ground, still trading back and forth, but the attackers will be reasonably pleased that that is the case. Their archers, after all, are probably the least important part of their attacking force, whereas the same can not be said, of course, of the defenders very much. Archers are going to be a significant part of what they do. Seafarers of Brithombar forming up some front lines as Toll and Gaurhoth start to make their way forward as the vanguard here. Hishbuk-Raz probably actually would be pretty efficient against the Seafarers. Like I said, a very specific tool, a light mace man. And very often they need to be utilised as part of a combined arms front line, which doesn't appear to be the case at the moment. Lancers of the two captains retreating from the initial ambush that happened in the alternate path. Dreadhelms do have a really good line of sight here. Again, it's only on Ironshard Legionaries, but they do need to rack up some significant victories, you would suggest. And DOL CUARTHOL, Archers of Talath Dirnin also arcing their shots in, so this initial Angband force is unlikely to have a huge amount of impact, but of course the attackers won't be too worried about that as long as they can consistently commit units in, and of course they've got ready access to reinforcements now that they've been allowed this little position. Meanwhile, Marksman of Balar, Marksman of Nargothrond, the heavy elven archers, but again, this is the problem with surrendering terrain to the attackers. It means that they can bring their own support forwards, and the Reavers of Anfalgleith in close proximity, javelins returning fire to archers is not really what the defenders would have wanted. You can certainly see the benefits to that defensive position, but the attackers denying them a large portion of that, and the Marksman of Balar retreating as a result. Rangers in close proximity mean the marksman's still able to shoot in. Guardsmen of the two captains, as well as the Wardens of Nargothrond, still the only defensive units here. I mean, there are huntsmen of the two captains getting involved as well. Projectiles being utilised and now being used as a makeshift infantry unit, as is always the way. So far enough to hold Angband at bay, but we have seen in the past how difficult that can be. Meanwhile, dear oh dear, what is going on here? What is that? Oh, it's the Banelings, yes. Self-detonating units, we'll call them. Well, they were just able to do a ton of damage there to some core units. I think that might have been all they achieved, however. The Dreadhelms taking damage, but oh, there they go. It's a very unique kind of unit, I suppose, that Dungortheb have. You know that they're not going to survive to see the end of the battle. Being this close to their own units, however, they could cause more harm than good in this engagement, considering the malleable nature of the attacking morale over here. The Dreadhounds now getting involved in melee, pulling out their swords. Projectiles already expended, but used reasonably well by the looks of things. Not tons and tons of kills, but at least consistent damage being done. Though so far, I have to say, I think the attackers have done the better in these initial engagements. Brigands of DOL CUARTHOL, again pulling out those morning stars of theirs, trying to finish off the Tormentors of the Iron Crown, who bore the brunt of that ambush. But you have to say, actually, considering they're still standing, certainly not the end of the world. Hishbut-Krau's warband, meanwhile, shaken in the face of the poison projectiles that are coming their way. All of the Gaurhoth wargs and the Gore Swarm heading the long way around. I do like the fact that all of the attacking armies are mixing and matching their forces. They're not just taking one section of the battlefield to focus fully on. They are interweaving their strengths, which is always a good thing from their perspective. Those Duso Manuthans should probably get a little bit closer to this engagement, however. That armor piercing will be useful going the other way, certainly against the Tormentors, however. Marksman Balar have a little bit of raised terrain over here. Huntsman, Javelins still available. I mean, they're running out of time to be able to use them effectively, however. I'm fully sympathetic of the fact that there's a lot going on in this battle for all the players involved, so there's a lot to focus on, but clever use of your ranged units is kind of the be-all and end-all for the defenders in a battle such as this. In come the Farathir Beleg, again, two-handed axemen in melee, trying to use their mass to push through here with the Gijak Skaraz chosen, but not making a huge amount of inroads just yet. The defensive line holding up reasonably well. Finarfin at its centre. A bit more damage dealing perhaps from DOL CUARTHOL. And over here, bigger front line, which in theory should be a little bit more advantageous for the attackers, but they haven't really been able to make anything stick over here just yet. But the presence of the Halberdiers on the front line is going to make it difficult for the defenders to gain a consistent foothold, and also, while some of those arrows will be scoring friendly fire, it's worth it from an attacking perspective to try and loop those shots, I would suggest. Down here, meanwhile, on the low ground, which I kind of thought would be the first port of call for the attackers, they haven't really got fully underway just yet. They've softened the enemy up a little bit, killing off these seafarers, which, again, another example of the attackers being fairly efficient and fairly savvy with their ranged units. Often bad signs for the defenders. They are going to be able to lay on a decent defence over here, but we'll see. Marines of Brythombar taking hits from the Mangonel over in the distance. Archers of Talath-Dyrnin still firing away. The Rangers of Brythombar have been fairly consistently firing away at the attackers who are massing up at the base of these cliffs. Some hits coming in from the Duso Manuthran Predators over there. The Wardens of Nargothrond have certainly proven themselves to be a very strong defensive bulwark so far in this battle, which they will need to be as this battle continues. Archers of Talath-Dyrnin now getting involved in melee. Of course, Elven Archers often fairly efficient in melee, all things considered, which they will need to be, but these Halberdiers, they are shaken and exhausted. If they can be convinced to rout, that could be a real difference maker. Raiders, Rangers of Brythombar taking consistent damage from those poison arrows. Hishbut-Krau's Howlers ready to move in, getting consistent gains being made now as Windy continues to push forward with his Gijak Skaraz in the vanguard. Morale hopping back and forth a little bit, so they do need to be a bit careful. Reavers getting involved in melee. Bit of range support, but unfortunately, if these Marksmen of Nargothrond still have ammunition, they want to be using their ammunition now before that front line falls apart. No sense in waiting around. Brood Mother moving forward. I mean, the problem here is I don't know if the defenders are going to have the manpower now. They needed to try and stop the attackers from getting their support units into a good enough position to be effective, I think, and that was a mistake that was made pretty early on the front end. Less of an option for them over here, admittedly. Marksman Balar, though, under normal circumstances, so good at trading projectiles, but not so much when you're talking about throwing axes getting into effective range of them. Raiders of DOL CUARTHOL managing to halt the advance of these Hishbut-Kraz warband at the very least, but this is more of a token gesture than anything, you would say. Keep an eye on that as we hop over to this side of the settlement. Full engagements happening once again. Tormentors of the Iron Crown surrounded by the Gore Swarm. Hishbut-Kraz moving forward, so again this combined factions approach that the attackers are taking. The attackers have played this very well, honestly, and the defenders have floundered a little bit in the face of it. Dusomanoothan Flesh Feasters, again the ideal unit for taking on the Seafarers, really. Yes, the armor piercing will be somewhat effective against them, but the damage they can deal in response to the Seafarers who are unsupported like this is going to be terminal, you would suggest. And also front lines left completely exposed. Flanking is going to be possible. Drastic measures now need to be taken by the defenders if they are to salvage any sort of dignity in this fight. The Iran Lim moving forward, I mean, they will easily defeat the Hishbut-Kraz Howlers, but again, all of the victories the defenders are enjoying are inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. All of the really important fights in the battle, the attackers are the ones reaping a bloody harvest. Again, the Seafarers can be a really efficient unit when used correctly, but not so here. Iran Lim against the Skull Splitters. Skull Splitters will not enjoy this fight at all. In fact, really none of the Dusomanoothan units will do particularly well against the Iran Lim in melee. So at range they'll have to do it. Even the Flesh Feasters, their damage won't really crack through the armour to the extent that it would allow them to win that particular engagement. Over here, ground being lost consistently. Archers of Talath-Din and broken and fighting to the death, so this is where this hilltop is going to be secured. Raiders of DOL CUARTHOL, Marines of Brythombar firing their javelins at point blank into the Brood Mothers, but I don't think the damage is going to be consistent enough for them to be successful. There's a lot of volleys going in. It's a shame, I guess, that the Marines of Brythombar are not the heavy damage javelins and instead of skirmishing javelins, otherwise this probably would have been enough actually to kill the Brood Mother off. Meanwhile, Marksman of Balar being engaged in melee, the other unit of Skull Splitters, accompanied by the armour piercing of the Gijak Scaraz Wolfguard, certainly useful against the heavier units from the Falathrim. Beast Hunters finishing off what remains of the DOL CUARTHOL forces over here. Raiders still going to be victorious over there, but in a highly Pyrrhic victory by the looks of things. Or Hishbut-Kraz on the way across. I mean, the vast majority of the attackers are now inhabiting this mountaintop. It is a very severe choke point defensive position, but I mean, they need to get as many of these units out of harm's way as possible, and they're not really doing a particularly good job of that either by the looks of things here. The defenders, old company of the House of Ransom, haven't really seen them get going at all either. Victory seems certain for the time being as the Ironshod Legionaries push through. I mean, a little bit of routing ahead of time might help the defenders' case. Foresters of Nembrithil, Iran Lim as well, so a bit of a rearguard action happening here. Yeah, unsurprisingly, the Ironshod Legion. I mean, I can see what the attackers were trying to do there. They were trying to just make things as difficult as possible for the retreat, and to a certain extent that's worked, but now that this has transpired, the defenders need to get all of these units across that river to the lighthouse as quickly as they possibly can. The pre-retreat of the Sartor Finderato will help matters there as well. Everything they can retreat here would be of great help, I'm sure. Really much left over here now, is there? Although there is still fighting occurring. Rangers of the two captains getting as many shots off as they can before they're inevitably engaged in melee, and again, right tool for the job from the attackers. Scourges of Gothmog will slice their way through the lightly clad pirates. Marksman Nargothrond probably going to try and put their backs to the wall and form up some sort of defence, but in so doing again, exposing themselves to a bit of arrow fire. They probably would have been better off engaging directly alongside the Rangers to try and kill off as many of these Scourges as possible. It's never going to be an efficient engagement at this point, but it's all about trying to blunt the attackers as much as possible ahead of the final stand. Putting all their eggs in that basket is the only hope the defenders have at this point in time. As the Scourges move forward, I mean, Prince Gwyndor heading backwards as well. And again, I know that their unique thing is something of an aggressive trait, but ultimately they are just a solid line infantry unit which could come in handy. I mean, just taking stock of what they have left. I mean, we will watch the final stand first and foremost of this unit of marksmen. Two-handed swordsman, I mean, less of an easy foe for the Scourges of Gothmog to bring down, I suppose. Nargothrond units in general for Finarfin tend to be very defensively adept, both in terms of their equipment and their skill. Further back, running back and forth from the Scourges, Hishtbukras on the march forward. Units left standing. I think these are the raiders of DOL CUARTHOL who have routed. The arrival of some heavier units in the shape of these Gijak Skaraz, turning that potential Pyrrhic victory into ultimately a defeat. I think the worry for the defenders will have to be, though, is that stuff like the Urush Abomination is still on the field. Still the small matter of the Hishbukras, Ash Priests, the Bulldogs, all of the true heavy hitters from the attackers are still available to try and prize the defenders off of their final stand location. I think the Urush Abomination in particular could be especially annoying. The Mangonel is ultimately more damaging, but the Abomination can use its ammunition at range and then ultimately be a bit of a nuisance in melee as well. A few of these Scourges are falling by the wayside, but keep an eye on that. Taking stock, I mean, what's going on over here? Marines of Brythombar are here in behind enemy lines for the most part. Foresters of Nembrethil as well, javelin support, although again the angle isn't particularly fantastic here from the javelins. They are able to just about crest the hill to a certain extent, but several of them hitting the dirt in front of them. Ironshot Legionaries on the way forward as well, and ultimately the Foresters of Nembrethil getting overwhelmed by Duso Manuthan units. And now the Marines having to engage in melee, and the Ironshod Legionaries, heavier unit. The Marines' fate is to be overwhelmed, unfortunately. Most of what the defenders have tried to do here is, not the wrong choice, but it just hasn't worked out for them, unfortunately. And it's left them with a bit of a mountain to climb here in what will be the final phases anyway. Taking stock of what they have left over here. Marines of Brythombar, so some javelin supports. The Brigands, a bit of armour piercing, lighter armour piercing. Old Company of the House of Ransom, a heavier, well, higher tier, shall we say, archer from DOL CUARTHOL. Company of Prince Gwyndor archers. Arankir Lim still reasonably healthy. 2 units of them as well, so that'll be important. Foresters, the Arine Ephedune, Nobles of Balar. I mean, all of the strongest defensive units that they have are still available to the defenders. So, I mean, the fact that the attackers still have a lot of their bodyguard units is not enough for the attackers to automatically think that victory is going to be inevitable. But the thing I will say, the numbers they still have available to them going to be difficult. Scourges of Gothmog still taking consistent damage, in all fairness. Bit of close support from these 3 scouts of Brythombar as well. I mean, you never know by what margin the battle is going to be decided, so every kill helps. So we hop across to what should be a bit more of a straightforward engagement for the attackers to polish off. These Marines of Brythombar very much fighting a losing battle. Defeat seems certain, only a military genius, and ultimately, of course, they break, fighting to the death. There's nowhere really they can retreat to after all, backs to the ocean as they have. Try and swim for it. It's worth it. Island hop. That's going to be it from them. Just taking stock of what the attackers have left, though. You can just tell from the minimap that there is a lot still here. The Mangonel crew no longer with their Mangonel in tow, so that's... I mean, if they still had the Mangonel, I would suggest that that would be completely it for the defenders. The bombardment they would be subjected to and the damage the Mangonel can do would ultimately be far too much for them to bear. As it is, they still have a huge hill to climb, as I've mentioned, but perhaps their quality can see them through. It rather depends on how much ammunition their units in support still have as well, because they'll need every ounce of that to be put to good use. Scourges of Gothmog still struggling to finish off their quarry over here. Victory does still seem certain for them, of course, but again, every one of these guys they can kill off will be useful. Officer being one of the spear guardsmen of the Iron Crown, and ultimately they rout, which is bad news for the scouts of Brythombar, because there's nowhere that they can run to anymore. Or is there? There is. There's a way up over there. That's a little bit... I feel like that might be a bit of an oversight on the map's part. I feel like that should probably be a shooting position that isn't able to be exposed in that way, but oh well. Garangui Gorswarm marching in. Interestingly enough, again, maybe the wrong tool for the job. Brigands of DOL CUARTHOL, after all. They may be one of the less important units they still have available to them, but that armour-piercing edge they have would be probably put to better use against stuff like Angband infantry in support of other frontline units than bugs. It does look pretty horrible though, doesn't it? The Garangui Gorswarm when they bunch up like that. I mean, the Gorswarm are intended to be effectively the trash unit for the attackers, so it should be a relatively simplistic task for these fighting men and elves to hold the Gorswarm at bay, but this is merely the beginning. As do so, Manuthan start to make their way forwards, Reavers who are out of ammunition, so the less important stuff being committed forward first, rather unsurprisingly. But as long as they keep the attack going here, the attackers, and keep things consistent, I feel as though their numbers should be enough to see them over the line, but this is where the true final phases begin, ahead of the final 10k frame, so if nothing else the defenders will put on a good show of it. Old company of the House of Ransom, what are they going to be firing at? They are going after the thralls, which I guess they don't have much of a choice given the fire coming their way. The best they can hope for is that the poison projectiles rout the thralls in short order. They're going after Reavers. I mean, the Bulldogs are on their way forward. As soon as they get committed to the front line, they will not be an easy foe to bring down. Tormentors as well. I mean, this is the thing, Angband, when the going gets tough, Angband's defensive prowess, along with their numbers, is usually the sort of thing to pull them through in battles like this. As I've mentioned, I think pound for pound, of all of the Silmarillion factions, from what I've seen on the open field and in siege battles, Angband are the most effective. Not the most elite, nor the most varied, but in terms of what Medieval 2 mechanics reward, Angband are very, very strong. And they're going to try and push. Are the defenders ready for this? I mean, time and time again we see defenders not willing or not quick enough to respond to this kind of pressure. Looks like they are going to this time, with Rearguard being committed forward. Of course, rather quickly this has meant that the Brigand's armour piercing will start to become a little bit more relevant. Iron-shot arbalists in close support. They're having to bend their shots, which does make crossbow bolts a little bit worse off. Still, they don't need spectacular damage at this point, just consistent extra little bits of damage to the defenders. Whole company of the House of Ransom getting involved in melee by the looks of things now, joining the Rearguard on the front line. So these are all strong units. Victory so far a reasonable expectation for the defenders. Nobles of Balar getting involved on the front line as well. Arrow fire coming in to the Iron-shot halberdiers. I mean, Rangers of Brythonbar, not a huge amount of them left, but all of those arrows need to connect with attackers, really. Nobles of Balar, of course, they'll be very effective, and they will counteract any sort of effect the Iron-shot halberdiers will have on the front line. A very useful trait indeed. Do so Manuthan on the way forward, already depleted. Hishbukraz. Yeah, most of this new wave is made up of less important units, admittedly, but the numbers are the important thing, and the consistency of the attack also. Ishbukraz ready to move forward. Yeah, this is where the Urish Abomination comes in, not needing to use ammunition earlier on. As you can see, the projectiles are not as devastating as catapult ones, but even if he only kills one elf at a time, that will really add up come the late game. The defenders leaving themselves with little margin for error. Unfortunately, though, there's nothing they can do about the Urish Abomination. He will sit there and use up all of his ammunition. The best they can do, really, is try and spread their units out a little bit. Ooh. That's a devastating hit in the light of the situation. Need to get these guys into loose formation, really. Maybe put them in here so that they can be committed to the front line, that other unit of Rearguard. Oftentimes it's a bad sign when the attackers are dictating what you can and can't do with your units, but it's better than just watching them get fried by the living artillery over there on the other side of the water. Let's do some Manuthan. Oh no, that's the Bulldogs, both of which have got the decorations on their back. The skulls also adorning the heavier units, heavier Iron Crown units from Angband. The Bulldogs being on the front line is a bit of a bad sign. In terms of sheer quality, it's the highest quality unit that is here. Still, arrow fire, Iron-shot arbalists finding their marks. Do so Manuthan. Still a small matter of these Karengui broodmothers, though we saw them take very consistent javelin fire earlier on, so there's every chance that they're actually reasonably weak at this point in time. Elephant tier units, of course, also weak to all of the spears and such. Orion Ephedun now being committed to the front line. I mean, another bodyguard tier unit. Probably not quite as savage as something like the Bulldogs, and they've probably let this, well, I mean, the attacks are trying to push through. The sides of the defence are still reasonably intact, though. The arrival of really all that remains from the Falathrim might be enough to counteract this, although I don't know if the defenders have yet another turning of the tide left in them in that regard, whereas I think the attackers probably do have another heavy push in them. Admittedly, though, that next time it happens, it will probably have to be the Gijak Skaraz driving it, rather than the Iron Crown. Company Prince Gwindor were also committed at some point. They might just be going all in at this point. There's a lot of wavering going on. I mean, that is the thing, the morale mechanics in Silmarillion are a little bit more punishing. If you try and force your way through like this and it goes wrong and you end up suffering from a chain rout, it can be the sort of thing which you don't recover from. Rearguard not quite yet ready to commit themselves, the other units of them. More Ironshod Halberdiers. Again, I still hold that the damage in this battle to the defenders may have been done in the earlier stages. Arqueni Mormagilwa getting onto the front line now, the most effective fighting unit that the defenders still have left for carving your way through orcs. And the Aran Kielim as well. I mean, it may as well be throw caution to the wind at this point. Still got those, I think it's still 2 units of Sartor. Certainly 1. Maybe the other unit's already been committed. Not much in the way of reinforcements left now. Maybe the other unit of Sartor is in here already. They are a relatively small unit after all. Very elite, but numbers important here. Maybe that's what the Aran Kielim can bring to the table. Only 6 of the nobles of Balar remain, so the most obvious choice for counteracting all of these freshly arrived halberdiers are breathing their last. Ryan Eferdun are reasonably healthy still, but any armour piercing that Angband and Tolan Gaurhoth are bringing to the table will be pretty effective against most of what the defenders have left, their heaviest, most elite units. Still quite a few units from the old company of the House of Ransom. Probably one of the stronger units that DOL CUARTHOL have available to them. Javelins on the way in. Again, showing signs of being a little shaky. Few units that are a little bit more depleted starting to rout. That is the defender's best chance here, if they're able to do consistent mental damage. There are some units, of course, which won't rout, stuff like the Bulldogs, who admittedly are probably taking a lot of damage at this point. I mean, 33. Still enough of them to be a considerable problem, but the Orion Afdun, the Arqueni Mormagilwa in particular, I think, are going to be really the be-all and end-all for the defenders at this point. Whether they can do the level of damage they need to, with the support of all of these units that are all around them, is going to be vital. Some more numerous units starting to feel the mental strain now. Defenders have left it all to do, but they do still have a bit of reinforcements as well, and it is both units of the Sartor Finderato up there. The last hurrah for their defence will be the most defensively adept unit they have, though admittedly, if it comes down to the very best units facing off against one another, the Sartor won't have the damage to do things all on their lonesome. A stirring final effort here from the defenders, however. I still don't think it's going to be enough. I think the manpower the attackers still have over on the other side of the river, the little bits of damage that their supporting units are still going to be able to do as well. Ironically enough, I think, well, I was going to say the Sartor could move in, but instead it's going to be the tattered remnants of the Brythombar units that make their way to the front line first. It might just be by being aggressive with the Sartor and trying to crush the morale, maybe from the two sides of this little engagement, that the defenders might be able to force the issue a little bit, but even then I'm not sure. Friendly fire from those poison projectiles is probably not helping the cause of the attackers any. Another unit of just over 20 Reavers now routing. Broken and fighting to the death on the front line as they are. Company Prince Gwindor still holding up reasonably well. The Aran Kielim, of course, ever the dependable unit. Certainly my favourite of all of the Falathrim units. Brythombar units backwards, the Marines anyway. If they've still got ammunition, that's understandable. If not, don't really see why not. You may as well leave them in there. The Arqueni, 50 of them still remain. Victory a distinct possibility for the attackers again, mainly through sheer weight of numbers, you would suggest. More units on the way across. Do something with the Beast Hunters, not the most impressive unit by any means. Wargs on their way through. 11 Hishtwood Kraz. Again, just bits and pieces being committed by the attackers at this point, just to keep the fires of the attack stoked. They do need to be a little bit careful though. A little bit of quality is maybe needed on the front line as well as all of these numbers, because so far that's how the defenders are still putting up this level of resistance. Something like the Ash Priests perhaps would certainly not go amiss. Any remaining Flesh Feasters. One thing that would obviously break the back of this defence is if the Broodmother was able to crash through and disrupt the defensive line. Again, mass pushing, ever everyone's favourite tactic. I think this is both units of Sartor, considering there's 43, 44, yeah. From Swampert's perspective, when do those guys get committed? I would probably commit them now, honestly. I mean, you can see there, yeah, as if on cue, that is a fresh unit of Flesh Feasters which have arrived. Bit of quality from Dungortheb. Bit of extra damage as well. Pretty useful against the likes of the company of Prince Gwyndor. Marines getting recommitted now, or at least put a little bit closer to the front line. Only just now half the enemy force remains. I think it goes to show how small the Finarfin army was initially. Which admittedly, the Finarfin units, individually speaking, have been pretty effective, as we've seen throughout the field, but for me, the army was just too small. And the reason for that, ultimately, is the 2 units of Sartor Finderato which have been brought, and we're only just going to see them now, and it might be too little too late from that perspective. And their presence on the front line is sorely needed now that the Karangwi Broodmother is also making its presence felt. The Arqueni Mormagilwa can do decent damage, but they are going to arrive now. Well, this, I guess, is the chance for Swampert's decision to be vindicated or condemned. If the Sartor Finderato can win this battle all on their lonesome, that small army would have been worth it. DOL CUARTHOL, the new faction, gone. Not too surprising though, this is the sort of battle which is more well suited, certainly for Finarfin and also for the few units of the Falathrim that do remain. Broodmother, still 60 around Kia Lim. 13 Bulldogs still standing. Impressive given the level of attention they've been receiving. There's not much in the way of Arqueni Mormagilwa left by the looks of it. That was the fleeing DOL CUARTHOL general. A morgue. Yeah, and this is where very oftentimes the end of the battle is nigh, when the attackers are able to get in and around a defensive position. The Mangonel crew, ironically, the ones that are going to be seeing the benefits of that. And they're over here, Company Prince Gwyndor, still 47 of them remain, but surely much is going to be left of them when all is said and done. Late commitment of the Sartor. Around Keelim broken. There's only 8 of them left, to be fair, and Silmarillion doesn't discriminate when things are looking bad for you, even if you're some of the very best that the elves have to offer. At least fighting to the death, but cold comforts, unfortunately for them. Pretty much all that the attackers have is now within camera shot, but that's still a fairly chunky section. A lot of those units back there are not all that important, but never really did see the Ash Priests. They may be in here somewhere. They're a small enough unit that they could blend in. Monstrous units. I mean, there was a lot to unpack actually in this battle. A lot of effective units. I can't even remember the name of them, but the ambush unit early on from DOL CUARTHOL ended up not working out for them. But you can certainly see the benefits of them. If the ambush had been a little bit more substantial rather than just one infantry unit and 2 light cavalry units, maybe it would have paid off more for the defenders and it wouldn't have started them on the wrong foot. That's not the unit itself's problem though. The banelings as well. Self-detonating spiders. They were certainly impressive. The mangonel, although we've seen the mangonel before. As far as DOL CUARTHOL goes, the Dreadhelms. Interesting kind of unit. I mean, I don't really feel as though we saw the faction in totality here, but we got an idea, I think, of what they could be all about. High damage, relatively lightweight, unique ambush potential with some of those units as well. It's a pretty decent debut from their perspective. Angry Broodmother's starting to fall away now, probably at the hands of the Sartor, given the extra damage those spears are capable of doing. Urish Abomination also now getting involved as well, swinging its mighty axe around. Yes, I think that's probably, yeah, and that's, you know, the early stages of the battle. Ultimately, the defenders just made too many missteps, and it was unrecoverable in the end. I think we will go up to ×2 speed just to hurry things along just a tad. The final stand was reasonable enough. They just gave themselves too much to do. Surrendering ground on that high plateau, was that really the right thing to do? Probably not. The whole point of that terrain is that you can take advantage of it as the defenders, and they willingly chose not to. Questionable, for sure. Still, it's nice to see a larger scale siege in Silmarillion once again. It is a bit of a rarity after all. Nice to see a new faction as well. I don't know if you'd want to be captured by any of these factions. I don't know whether being captured by Angband or Dungortheb would be more horrifying. Probably Dungortheb. Getting fed to spiders is not exactly an enviable fate, but yes, this stretch of coast now belongs to the evil forces of Beleriand. And there we have it. In terms of kills, again, that Finarfin army, just too small. When you're dealing with units like this, I mean, it can be so tempting to go for those elite units, but I've said time and time again, if you go into the extreme of that, you end up with this kind of situation where you just get overwhelmed. Like, numbers, you need some sort of basis. Yes, quality is important, and it can be at the centre of things, but if you go into the red limit on those bodyguard units, it's very, very rarely a good idea. Unless you have so much money because the odds are supposed to be so against you that you can do that and then still have a full army. On this occasion, though, that was certainly not the case. Once again, we saw the strengths of Angband in particular, I think, with, you know, again, numbers, heavy-duty infantry, just again, all of the things that, like I said, Medieval 2 rewards. And Dungortheb had their best battle in a while, I would say. I mean, more times we've seen them of late, they have been on the receiving end of some pastings, and I think that's largely because these more ambush-style factions, they are a little bit more difficult to play. And Dungortheb with their monsters, again, a lot of their units are relatively low numbers because of the monstrous nature of them, but you can supplement that with high numbers, do so Manuthan infantry. That's what Boris did here, and he used them to good effect. Windy, of course, you know, less kills for him, but that's not really too much of a problem. You know, those wargs were still useful. The Gijak Scaras proved their worth as well. They may not be quite on the same level as the equivalent Angband units, but they can still do similar sorts of things while still allowing Tol and Gaurhoth to have their own identity. Like I said, you know, Finarfin needed to rethink their composition, I think, and the defenders in general needed to rethink their priorities when it came to that initial defence. The ambush in the north was, well, not in the north technically, it's the east as we look at it, but the ambush in the east was too insubstantial, needed more. And the fight for the plateau needed to be done on the front foot a little bit more without surrendering so much ground so early. But yeah, let's see what did the damage for Dungortheb. Flash Feaster's doing quite nicely. Beast Hunters are throwing projectiles. For the Predators, maybe less so. Flash Feaster's doing nicely though, obviously that is their highest tier of infantry unit. The Banelings with 120, and obviously that really helped with dealing damage to those front lines, which was giving them a bit of a problem. The Urish Abomination, by the time that was being utilised, they had already pulled up a bit of a lead. The Broodmother, however, was very, very useful. It really helped disrupt what remained of the defensive position on the plateau, and then ultimately towards the end as well, really started to hammer home that mass. So yes, I believe it was J-Monster once again who sent this to me. So again, it's from Boris's perspective, but it was sent to me by someone else. But still, big thank you to the pair of them, and big thank you to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. I'm sure that Windy's probably already covered this one by this point, but we'll see, I guess. As far as what's coming up next, this is actually the final battle I have in my current backlog that I'm going to be doing as far as weekend slots go. Still have a few more Silmarillion battles that I've got earmarked for midweek battles as and when I can do them, but we'll see. At this point in time, it's a case of waiting and seeing how the month develops, the first month of 2024. So yeah.